This is All India Radio. In the program Spotlight Now, we bring you a discussion on outcomes of second G20 finance ministers and central bank governors meeting. The participants are Sharad Kohli, economic analyst, and Arjun J. Chaudhary, AIR correspondent.
I'm joined in the studio by economic analyst Shri Sharad Kohli on the topic of the second G20 finance ministers and central bank governors meeting. We'll try and understand from our expert what the outcomes are of this second G20 finance ministers meeting and how the central governors will decide on policy in their respective nations. Sharad, a warm welcome to you in the program.
My greetings to all the listeners of All India Radio.
Sharad, for the benefit of our listeners, do tell us the implications and importance of this G20 grouping and what does it mean when finance ministers and central bank governors come together to discuss on any issue concerning policy.
Arjun, what makes this meeting different and special for us is for two prime reasons, and I would love to highlight those reasons here. The first reason being that India now holds presidency of G20. So I think the world and the G20, they are the biggest countries of the world. Some of the largest economies of the world are part of G20. So therefore, India taking the lead. So whatever India is going to say, the world is going to listen. I think not just listen, but people are going to look up to, considering the fact that India has been declared as the fastest growing economy in the world just a few days ago, 5.9%. In a situation and a circumstance where the world economy is coming under pressure, 2.8% is the global economic outlook, whereas Indian output is double or even more than double, shall I say. So I think the world will be looking up to it. So I think that is my first point. The second point, which makes this meeting important, is the situation around the globe, because this meeting is happening at a time when the world economy is facing a challenge. The challenge was COVID from 2020 to 2022 early, or maybe 2021. For two and a half years, the world was badly impacted by COVID-related trouble. And soon as the countries tried to come out of the COVID problem, we had the Russia-Ukraine war. And I think that spiraled into a huge economic crisis because the prices started rising, the supply chains were disrupted completely, energy prices shot up, fuel prices shot up, dollars started rising, interest rates started rising. So there was multiple economic parameters which went completely haywire, and the world had not even recovered from COVID, and it had to take the second blow. So I think this meeting is happening at a time when the world economy is going through a very, very challenging time. And I would say that recession is knocking at the doors of the world. So every single challenge on the economic and financial front that this world is facing is on the table for discussion. So I think these are the two things, Arjun, in my understanding, which makes this meeting very special and very different from such kind of meetings which have happened in the past.
And what about fiscal policy in terms of countries incurring debt in order to facilitate their economy? So how important is managing debt? We have Prime Minister Narendra Modi even talking about the importance of debt, which has to be discussed as well at these forums. The importance of managing and administering how bonds are issued and the kind of debt being incurred by nations.
Well, I think after COVID, Arjun, we did see a challenge on that front. And even if you take Indian example, our debt was between 50 and 60 lakhs a few years ago. But then because of the multiple development initiatives taken by the government of over 100 lakh crores, I'm talking of the Indian perspective, we can then replicate to the world. Then came COVID and, India had to come out with a Atmanirbhar Bharat Abhiyan where lakhs of crores of schemes were launched. So I think a country which is emerging, which is developing, for them, I think debt to a certain extent becomes normal. But then the challenge before the world is that what when you get over-leveraged? That is, take for example America. American debt is far more than the GDP. India's debt at least is not anywhere near the GDP right now. So I think the concern is when your debt to GDP ratio gets completely haywire and, it becomes very, very adverse. I think that is a panic button for the country. So that is what the Prime Minister referred about, that we should have global policy on debt, that how much debt can be taken, how much can a country leverage, and then the interest rates. Let's not forget the big culprit, interest rates. We look at what has happened to the interest rates over the last 1.5 years. They have shot through the roof. So I think debt becomes even more adverse when debt servicing becomes adverse, whether it is repayment of the debt or it is the servicing of the interest. So the interest rates hovering around in a country like America, hovering around 6-7%, which is unheard of for countries which used to have 0% interest. They are not used to giving 6 to 7% interest for several decades now. So I think that is a challenge. They are finding it tough to service the debt. And we've seen Arjun countries collapse. We've seen Sri Lanka, what happened to Sri Lanka. We saw Pakistan. Countries which are in a debt trap right now. They've got nothing to repay. They need more debt to repay the debt. They need more debt to repay the interest. They need more debt to be restructured, which is why, India, France, and Japan just a couple of days ago took an initiative and come forward to make sure that we can restructure Sri Lanka's debt, because they know that even if IMF has sanctioned $2.8 or $2.9 billion bailout package, it is not going to last forever. So I think that is what the concern is, that can the debts be made more friendly? Can we have a longer duration of repayment? Can the interest rates be lower? Basically, to try and make the debt more friendly is one. Second, how much of debt is enough? I think that is also on the table. And I think as far as the Indian, G20 presidentship is concerned and Indian leadership is concerned in G20, see, India's Nara of Vasudev Kutumbakam, I think India is pursuing that throughout, because what India is focusing on, Arjun, is inclusive growth. If we say Sabka Saath, Sabka Vishwas domestically, I think India is trying to replicate, and this principle is applicable universally, even across the world. Why should some nations be left behind? Why should some nations always remain underdeveloped? Why should some nations always be roaming around with a begging bowl, asking for money? Why should some nations always be looking up to richer nations? Why can't we have a world where inclusive growth is the policy, where we make sure when we make a global policy on economics and finance, or we make any global policy on trade, for example, why can't we have an inclusive growth where the nations who are poorer, the nations who find difficult to meet both their ends, the nations whose per capita income is extremely low, why can't these troubled countries be also included in policy making? Because we've seen in the past, and why is India raising this issue? And the answer is here, because the policies that were being made so far across the world, they were only focused on some nations. That is why we saw some nations becoming very, very big, and some of the other nations who find it difficult to run even their government. The government salaries also don't come, and they just keep waiting for aid to come from here. And they look at United Nations, they look at World Bank, they look at IMF. This is why, Arjun, that also brings me to the point that Multilateral Development Bank, the MDBs, were on the table for discussion, because we need more of IMFs, we need more of World Banks, we need more of ADBs, so that they can help these smaller countries. They can ensure that there is regional development of the countries. That is why multilateral development banks and their capital adequacy ratio was also being discussed, that they should have sufficient capital, because how much can you leverage a bank? How much can a bank lend? We should all know, for the listeners of All India Radio, that how is World Bank and IMF run? The richer countries, they contribute corpus, they contribute funds, and that is how it is run. So there is a need for more such smaller banks which are regionally distributed, so that these countries don't have to keep knocking the doors of these larger banks who may not always be in a position to fund them.
So we had the Global Sovereign Debt Roundtable GSDR meeting that was held on the 12th of April, and this was co-chaired by the Honorable Finance Minister, the MD of the IMF, and the World Bank President as well. So which do you think is the more important issue that has to be tackled, or is it to be taken together? Debt management to avoid a debt crisis or a debt trap, or do you see inflation as a primary concern for central banks right now, even though there seems to be a great deal of interrelationship between both the monetary policy and the fiscal policy of nations?
Well, you hit the nail on the head, Arjun, because what you said in the second part of your statement just now, both are related to each other. I mean, if we talk on inflation and debt or interest rate, they are related to each other. There is a cause-effect relationship between the two. And we saw that happening when the inflation shot through the roof. We found interest rates climbing, and they were going through the roof. As I just said, for a country like America or Japan, which were used to 0% interest rates, 6 to 7% interest rates was unimaginable for these countries. So I think inflation became the culprit, and the sufferer were the interest rates as a monetary policy tool. And as far as the fiscal policy is concerned, I think governments around the country, with regard to their tax revenue growth and other aspects, they were struggling, because it was very difficult. When the inflation rises, your demand falls. If your demand falls, your tax collection goes down. So they are both interrelated, and that is why, if you ask me as to why are the finance ministers and the central bank governors meeting together, because they work in tandem. They have to synchronize with each other, whereas the monetary policy on one hand has to be driven by the fiscal policies. On the other hand, fiscal policies get driven by monetary policies. So there is a cause-effect relationship between the two, Arjun, which is why I'm glad that both the group of these meetings are happening together. And I think a very synchronized approach is being taken, that monetary policy should go hand in hand with the fiscal policy, and fiscal policy need to keep in mind the decisions taken by the monetary policy. So that is the whole idea. And I think the biggest point of discussion in these meetings must have been interest rates, which has been the talk of the world for that matter. The repo rate in India, or the Fed rate in America, or Bank of England rate. I think those rates must be the biggest point of discussion. And I'm sure underneath that discussion must be inflation, that for God's sake, bring the inflation down, make sure that the supply chain disruptions are removed, make sure that the excess liquidity is sucked away so that inflation comes under control. And the moment inflation comes under control, I think interest rates can see a U-turn happening. And we're already seeing that. We saw the American inflation rate coming down a couple of days ago, which I think should motivate the American Fed to probably take a pause in the Fed meeting. And we saw this pause happening in India. And with Indian inflation cooling down, we can see a further pause in the RBI's monetary policy to be happening 2 months hereafter. So I think interest rates and inflation are the two most important agendas. Besides that, Arjun, if you allow me, I think tax transparency was also one of the issues, because sharing of information with each other is the biggest, because tax evasion has been a matter of trouble for the countries around, these tax havens and, people trying to use transfer pricing and other techniques to evade tax. So if tax transparency comes, and OECD has been mentioning about this time and again. So I think if this information sharing between the countries happens, and a classic example is India and Switzerland. We all know what reputation Switzerland had some time ago, but ever since the Indian government has signed the mutual information sharing agreement, we find that no more tax evasion happens to Switzerland. So these kind of information sharing and transparency comes around the world. I'm sure it is going to mitigate the problem of tax evasion, because that leads to revenue loss. It also promotes sometimes illegitimate activities. People get away with money laundering and things like that. So I think that is tax transparency all about. And then one more aspect was crypto assets. I think we all have been talking about crypto assets for a very, very long time now. And Government of India has been neutral, although it hasn't been legitimized, but it has been neutral on the issue of crypto assets. I think a uniform policy and transparency on digital assets has to be formed, crypto assets in particular I'm talking about. So I think the countries have to unanimously agree to a uniform crypto policy. At this point of time, I find different countries have different policies, which is why, crypto assets still have become a headache for a better part of the world.
Sharad, you mentioned about liquidity. To what extent is liquidity being addressed at the G20 meeting of finance ministers and central bank governors? Because the COVID crisis has created this situation of excess liquidity in the US, where families have been given paychecks for months on end, and they have in fact spent it on buying securities. So how do you ensure that asset prices are cooled down instead of going up, because it's circulating from one market to another?
Well, I think countries who have given paychecks may have sounded very good at that time, but they have paid the price, because the inflation in these respective countries have become beyond control. I mean, the monetary policy measures have only partly helped. So which is the reason for excess liquidity. I mean, once you put in excess liquidity in a country, you're definitely going to find it difficult to control inflation. So I think this is more of an agenda of the central bank governors to discuss as to how to suck away the liquidity, how to make sure that the excess money floating around in the economies gets sucked away, gets parked in its right place, so that, inflation can come down, and the right way of balancing the debt can also happen. So that is definitely on the table. I'm sure of the global, financial collective wisdom and the global economic collective wisdom is definitely going to balance this out. After this meeting, you're going to implement it. What seems to us like just a discussion or a meeting, we should all know that once this meeting is over, these respective finance ministers and the central bank governors are going to come back to their respective countries, and all that has been discussed and agreed is going to be implemented. So you'll start seeing the impact of this meeting. It is not just a meeting of a few heads meeting together, having a cup of tea or coffee and a meal and then dispersing. No, that's not the case. So everything will be implemented, and I am very hopeful in the next 3 to 6 months, you will see these policies and these resolutions being implemented, and you'll start seeing the ground level impact. Having said that, I must add here that the world is still facing geopolitical challenges, whether it is China, Taiwan, whether it is the North Korean peninsula, whether it is Syria, Lebanon, Israel, that part of the world, Russia, Ukraine, anyways, very much on right now. China versus US, the economic tensions and sometimes even the military bickerings we see here and there. So I think these geopolitical tensions should not flare up if the world economy and world monetary system has to stabilize. Because if any flare up from here happens, Arjun, I have a fear that things can further, deteriorate, and you might see global recession setting in sooner than we can imagine.
Well, thank you so much, Sharad, for being with us on the program and talking to us extensively on the second G20 meeting of finance ministers and central bank governors.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
You were listening to a discussion on outcomes of second G20 finance ministers and central bank governors meeting. The participants were Sharad Kohli, economic analyst, and Arjun J. Chowdhury, AIR correspondent. This program was produced and presented by the News Services Division of All India Radio. You can listen to it on our mobile app News on AIR. This program is also available on our YouTube channel News on AIR Official. You may share your feedback about this program through email at airnsdtalks@gmail.com or WhatsApp on 928-909-4044.